I'm Jason Carvalho, as Zuni mentioned. Not only am I chairman of Carvalho Capital and have been invested in space tech for the last 5 to 6 years, I also run a podcast called Specific Impulse, hosted with Jeff Dormer, who is the former VP of Propulsion for SpaceX and currently CEO of Portal Space Systems. So if you want to learn a little bit more about space tech, please check out Specific Impulse. Today's session, Quantum in Space, explores a convergence that just 5 years ago might have sounded like science fiction. Quantum computation, neuro-inspired AI, and off-world infrastructure working together in real time. These technologies are no longer theoretical. They're being deployed and funded at scale. In the last 5 years, over $28 billion has been invested in space tech and $7 billion in quantum, with 2024 breaking new records. So what happens when you bring brain-inspired AI models to orbit, when quantum protocols begin to govern how your satellites communicate, when real-time logistics systems need to operate beyond Earth's surface with minimal human oversight? These aren't abstract questions anymore, and the people on the stage are building the answers. Rafal and Janik from Xanadu, pioneering quantum hardware and chip-level innovation. Francis Jeanson from Ontario Brain Institute, applying Neuro, AI, and diagnostic models at scale. Michael Graham from NASA. Sure. Thank you. NASA, shaping resilient edge computing and space logistics. And Adam Gryfe, there we go. Adam Gryfe from CSMC, leading development on quantum secure comms from orbital systems. We'll begin with 40 minutes of moderated discussion, then open up to audience QA. Whether you're a policymaker, founder, investor, or researcher, this is your window into a frontier that's unfolding in real time. So we'll start with Michael. Michael, let's start with scale, because scale changes everything. SpaceX has mastered 10-ton payloads to orbit. But how do we leap to 500,000 tons to Mars? What unsolved challenges, from thrust to weight ratios to material limits, still block that scale? What's really keeping mass space travel grounded?
Thanks, Jason. So the main thing there is that as the scale of the actual launch vehicles changes, the materials and processes problem sort of fades away a little bit in regards to now you're actually able to use standardized manufacturing fabrication techniques to en masse develop and fabricate the shiny boxes or whatever it is that's going to Mars. So there's one aspect to it there of getting over the fact that everyone thinks that it still has to be a new piece of tech that has to be developed from manufacturing. It can just be the actual technology that gets changed. That's the number one thing. The other part is, I'll say the bureaucratic process of understanding that it's now a logistics problem as opposed to a science mission. So getting the bureaucracy at every level to change their understanding of cadence, scale, and requirements even from the local and regional community. So there's a few different things that are at play. So just to sort of recap, like I said, the scale part is one thing. It enables more standard fabrication materials and processes. And then the other is bureaucratic process. People actually understanding that, hey, there's more for us to do, which also means including more people. From the legal, from even marketing is a big thing. We tend to be space nerds doing space nerd things, and not really getting out there and saying what it is that we're actually up to.
I'll just do a follow-up question. So can you give us one concrete breakthrough, maybe material, fuel, or launch system that would unlock an order of magnitude leap in lift capacity?
Well, I'm the CEO of North American Space Institute, so I think that one of the biggest hurdles is people. how many people, how are you going to scale the amount of work that gets done, not just at a SpaceX or Blue Origin, how are you actually going to do the work? So it's a bit of a mind shift change going from, again, engineers and bureaucracy and more into a commercial mindset of, hey, how are we actually training and developing people on the ground? Because it enables the finance commercial part of it, which means instead of paying, a high-end aerospace engineer, now you have a tech that can actually do the work. So now the economics start to actually make more sense. You combine that with standard materials, you no longer have to 3D print the whole top to bottom of the satellite. It makes a big difference.
And in Canada, one of the areas for improvement that we have to focus in on is being able to create environments for testing, correct?
Yes.
Test beds and so forth. The reason why the United Kingdom and the US are so much further ahead is because of their vertically integrated systems.
Yeah, exactly. So I got my start in space at the David Florida lab. And so it's the lab that actually started the Canadian Space Agency. They actually broke out the headquarters and went to Montreal. And the reason why they started at the lab was because they always knew that they needed the facilities, the infrastructure to actually develop, house, and maintain expertise and how to test and ensure reliability and replicability. Yeah, replicability, whatever that's called. Yeah, reproducibility, there you go. Into space. So that was why their first asset investment was into the lab. And yeah.
And testing is extremely important when we talk about space technology because
because you have to get into the reliability and reproducibility of whatever it is that you're sending out there. And so, again, the platform for that is actually the facilities that get used to do the work, which again speaks back to the techs. That's how I got into the Space Institute, which is you need a bunch of techs to do the work. And so if the bureaucracy does what they did, which was shut down, said facility in Ottawa, you now no longer have a test bed to enable commercialization and startups and SMEs who can't afford to do the asset and capital allocation to develop their own facilities.
And the testing is really important. To double click on that, you have like Brampton and other cities are emerging areas for space technology, MDA putting money into robotics labs and so forth. But again, companies can't unlock those Fed dollars unless they test. And we won't get into the complications of testing, but those requirements are needed in order to unlock the Fed dollars. Private capital can only kind of go so far, obviously. Let's move from motion to power. Adam, you're designing nuclear reactors compact enough to power outposts and space vehicles. What does that unlock for orbital and lunar infrastructure? Walk us through how a nuclear-powered logistics chain in orbit differs from Earth-bound supply chains, and what risks define that future?
That's a lot of questions. So power is a gating factor for pretty much everything we do in space. Space is characterized by resource constraints. As you move further away from Earth, power becomes more and more important and harder to come by. So in low Earth orbit, you are privileged enough to have solar power, obviously from the sun. As you move to the lunar surface, you start to run into issues. Lunar day is 14 days. Lunar night is also 14 days. At any point on the majority of the moon, you're going to encounter 14 days of darkness. Solar is non-viable. A lot of the systems that are being sent up to the moon today, for anyone following it, goes up. It will perform about a 2-week mission, and then everyone holds their breath to see if it will survive lunar night and come back into operation on the other end of it. So obviously fossil fuels, not an option. Hydro, no. Wind, no. So nuclear becomes sort of a gating capability for sustained space operations anywhere outside of low Earth orbit. This becomes important as we do more and more in space, where resources become a challenge. So even with the launches that are becoming more and more accessible, it's difficult and resource consuming to launch vehicles into orbit and refuel. A Starship, for example, requires 10 to 20 additional Starships to refuel it in orbit, right? So a lot of work right now is going on around the industrialization of resources. For example, on the lunar surface, you need a lot of power for that. That's where the nuclear system comes in. There's a lot of other technologies as well. We're working on a quantum sensor right now that can do highly precise subsurface mapping from orbit as well, using some novel quantum systems for that.
Just a follow-up question. How are you thinking about the political and regulatory tailwinds or headwinds for orbital nuclear deployment in the next decade? I don't know if you're thinking about it, but...
Oh, it's all I think about. So, look, nuclear is a hot... There's a nuclear renaissance going on right now. If you follow anything happening in the US, there's dozens of competitors coming out with all sizes of nuclear reactors, from kilowatt scale to megawatt scale to tens to hundreds of megawatt scale, rapidly deployable, grid compatible, you name it. This is an emission-free energy source that can last for upwards of 10 years at a time without refueling, can be deployed to off-grid situations. It's powering a lot of the future and considerations for data centers right now. You're seeing a lot of innovation from Meta, from Google. So it's starting to be seen as sort of this self-contained power source for power-hungry operations like data centers. So what I'm going to say is the dual use tailwinds are all blowing in the right direction right there. Yes, there's a future forward in space, and that's an important opportunity for sustained space innovation. In the Canadian context, the dual use is in modernizing our Arctic infrastructure. This week, there's a huge NATO summit, and Mark Carney's there talking about spending 5% of Canadian GDP on defense spending, and a lot of that comes down to modernizing Arctic infrastructure that, again, is resource starved. It needs power, and half the year it's dark, and you can't rely on frozen waterways, and nuclear is seen as a key enabling capability for all of these resource-starved power requirements.
So we'll stay with you. So on that topic, let's pull back that national security lens. As Russia deploys nuclear icebreakers and autonomous fleets in the Arctic, how is Canada positioning itself to maintain strategic autonomy in maritime and polar operations? And a follow-on to that, are our investments in PNT, positioning, navigation, and time, drone surveillance, and naval propulsion keeping pace? Are we falling behind the geopolitical curve?
Yes. We're definitely falling behind the geopolitical curve, I would say. I mean, it's unfortunate to say. Canada is obviously a first world country. We invest a lot in innovation. Quantum is something, and we were talking about advanced position navigation and timing capabilities, things that are resilient to GPS spoofing, which is a big topic of concern right now. Yet a lot of people are turning to quantum systems and inertial measurement systems in order to create these resilient capabilities.
And just to double click, why are they turning to quantum? Just for the layman.
Quantum is more resilient than traditional geo-navigation options. So like advanced position navigation timing is an alternative to GPS systems. GPS signals can be spoofed or mimicked through malicious means, right? So what that does is it creates a vulnerability in the military and defense supply chain, or operational chain, and logistics. So quantum allows you to bring the technology into a self-isolated unit, one that is not dependent on remote signals, and therefore is less susceptible to the spoofing activity or malicious activity. So it's at the moment, bad actors aren't able to find ways to interfere with quantum-driven PMT solutions.
We'll discuss it.
Raphael, let's go to the edge, literally. So Raphael, how close are we to seeing quantum edge computing enabling real-time decisions in swarm robotics, satellite communications, or autonomous and battlefield systems? Is the bottleneck still in the hardware, the architecture, or the economics?
Yeah, I mentioned here I'm going to be the wet blanket. I'm definitely going to live up to that expectation. We're far away. Quantum computing is still not here right now. We have a really bad habit of saying it's 5 years away, so I'm going to tell you it's 5 years away. We've been saying that for 35 years, so word of warning. We don't have these technologies deployed yet on a data center scale. There's a number of companies that might tell you otherwise. You'll notice they're all public companies that need to keep their stock prices high, but not a single one of those quantum computers today can perform a task that you can't do on your laptop or in a decently sized data center. So that truly transformational impact of a quantum computer, of driving a solution to a problem in 2 minutes that would take 7 million years in a supercomputer, has only been done on really esoteric mathematical problems, but hasn't been done on any real world business problem. All the systems that we know about today are going to be the sizes of multiple football fields to deliver those first applications. And that's still, I'm going to say, that 5 years away. After that, to actually get it deployed on the edge, you're going to have to start thinking about, how do you miniaturize these technologies? How do you put them on something that is not requiring a nuclear power plant in order to be driven? How do you shrink it down? One thing to say, this is for quantum compute. Quantum sensing we have today. So the PNT systems, they're not representing that transformational leap over traditional sensing technologies, but you could get a much better magnetometer, so something that can measure the magnetic field to do that subsurface mapping or to do that dead reckoning navigation. You could get a much better gyroscope that instead of using now physical components, uses light and a fiber optic cable with incredibly low noise to do dead reckoning with a gyroscope. But for
and just for the dead reckoning is?
Just, you honestly close your eyes and you try to count how many steps you've taken and how much you turned in each and every single direction. And normally we do this with a spinning piece of metal that can measure exactly how much you turned, but little vibrations, little bleeds of energy impact that, and as you go further along, you get further and further off course. We can do that much better now. There's been some exciting demonstrations that are competitive with GPS over distances of hundreds of kilometers that make this really attractive for dual-use applications right now.
And just to go back to basics, the 101, by definition for quantum edge computing, how do you define that?
So quantum computing for me is going to be leveraging quantum physics to perform a computation. Not necessarily faster, but eliminating many of the steps you would need to get to the final answer. That gives you a better than quadratic speed up. So if it took you, 100 minutes to run, it will take 10 minutes or less to run on that quantum computer. And then for edge compute, you're going to have to deploy it on something mobile, something close to where you need the computation, outside of that centralized data center.
And again, for the audience, what's the definition of edge computing?
Well, that's what I'm saying, right? It's just either right with you on your vehicle, on your spacecraft, on your ship, and not sitting in that central data center. Yeah.
Sure. And then just a follow-up question. If a startup wanted to build for the future today, where should they start? Software, hardware, protocol layer?
Yeah, software is really hard. Like, you're relying on the quantum hardware company to get there within a timeline that matches up with your runway. And we've seen in Toronto alone, thanks to the Creative Destruction Lab, probably around 15 quantum software startups come out. Many of them have become successful companies, but none of them are actually quantum companies anymore. Most of them have become AI, materials, classical optimization type of companies. They still keep a part of that quantumness, hoping that the hardware will get there eventually. The protocol layer is actually really interesting. The major bottleneck to quantum computers being available and useful today is really error correction. This is the ability, as you go through your computation and every step of the way, to be able to identify and correct any error that creeps in. And this is a wildly unexplored work, and there's a number of companies that are focused just on that part of the stack, that protocol part. And then hardware, I encourage everybody to get into hardware. It is so soul crushing, so hard, so capital expensive. But the really great thing is that even if you're building a quantum computer, you're developing a ton of hardware that has applications for problems today, even though they're not for quantum. So we actually today, with Minister Solomon, opened the world's most advanced photonic semiconductor packaging facility, actually in the basement of our office tower, right next to a Dollarama storeroom. But that's being used already by aerospace companies. They're engaging with us. I would say some classical computer hyperscalers that may or may not be in the room are also looking to engage for their next generation photonic platforms. So there's opportunities to leverage tech you develop for one application for much nearer term applications.
And we briefly were chatting a bit about organizational design and hiring. And you mentioned you've been hiring out of the semiconductor sector. Can you correlate? Can you explain why?
Yeah, I mean, early days we were all quantum optics PhDs, and I was just trying to understand how would you even build a quantum computer on a photonic platform. Now it's much more about scalability and manufacturability. So we know that data center will have millions of components. You have to manufacture that at scale. This is going to be done in the largest semiconductor fabs that we have, and already we're partnering with companies like Tower Semiconductor in the US, IMEC in Europe, many others across the world that can really drive that volume. But prototyping something is very different than manufacturing at scale. And those quantum optics PhDs aren't enough. You need to start pulling from fabrication process engineers, from the semiconductor industry, in order to make sure that the high performance you can get on the lab scale, you can actually translate to a manufacturable scale as well.
Very exciting. Francis, let's bring this down to the brain. We still lack high fidelity early detection for many complex neurological disorders. How does quantum imaging help close that gap? And then to add, what's emerging at the intersection of pattern recognition, robotic neural interfaces, and quantum logic that might transform diagnostics?
Okay, another set of
Loaded questions. You can thank Zuni for that.
Oh, sorry, higher? Okay, everybody hear me? Great. Yeah, let's see. So, big challenges for sure in diagnostics. I mean, in the area of, neurological brain disorders, it's a very important area. 1 in 3 people in the, during their lifetime will experience a brain disorder, which is a pretty heavy and afflicting family of brain conditions. And so it's really important that we diagnose these things well, right? It's really important that we understand how they work or what they are, and that we can diagnose them as early as possible. And I think that's one of the fundamental things that we're seeing in the health space in general. Like, can you diagnose and detect a disorder early enough so that you can intervene as soon as possible? And so developing better sensors, better techniques to detect these disorders earlier on is really the name of the game. In terms of technologies and sensors, so we have a family of technologies that we know quite well that already exist. There's the traditional, you could say, old school technology, which is your family physician, right? Understanding what you call phenotypes, phenotypic traits of a patient by the way maybe they walk, the way they talk, the pains that they have, the way that they're thinking, reflecting, maybe performing a simple drawing task and not doing quite well. So the famous task looking at a clock, for example, that you may have to draw a clock and make sure that that clock ideally is properly drawn, symmetrical, etc. But not everybody can unfortunately do that well when they're starting to suffer from certain brain disorders. So those are the basics, right? Unfortunately, those tend to capture that disorder later on. New technology, and over the years, over the last 3-4 decades, we've had great technologies emerge. Actually, since the 1940s, we had early work looking at EEG, right? So these sensors that you put on the brain, they're electrodes, and they look for tiny little minute changes in the brain activity. And they actually happen to be extremely effective at capturing time, the time at which these events on the brain take place. What they're not very good at is capturing the precision of the location and anything that's happening deeper in the brain. But if you put these electrodes on the surface, and you have a lot of them, you can start to really see patterns emerging at a very precise time points. And you can pick up things that are abnormal sometimes in what you call ERPs, or event-related potentials. So you have these little spikes, like you have this brainwave happening. And you can pick up these little transformations that take place that are abnormal, they may not be usual. But they typically, on a healthy person, they might happen at 300 milliseconds, or they're going to happen at 600 milliseconds. But with somebody who has a brain disorder, you can actually pick these up really quickly. And this is without even necessarily having some sort of task that they have to do. It's just through standard, just sitting there, being relaxed, and just getting that information captured. So those are like this is actually fairly old technology, in our day and age. It's stuff that's been around for a little while. But it is becoming extremely important, and still is very important today, because we're developing better techniques to analyze that data. The frequency of these things are increasing. The number of electrodes are increasing. The way that we can wear them is improving. Before, you could only wear them in the clinic. You have to go, they put a gel cap on you. It takes like half an hour to an hour to set this thing up. You have to troubleshoot it and then start recording. Now we have these headsets that you can just wear at home and collect a lot of this great information and start monitoring the health of patients or individuals at home, anytime during the year, during the day, even at night when you're learning this thing, and help with understanding are people even sleeping well, right? And is their sleep quality having an impact on the quality of life, or having an impact on health? So this EEG technology is still extremely valuable, and just going through new phases of evolution as we speak. We have a lot of other great technologies that are emerging as well, in the magnetic resonance imaging, for example. Super high tech, really interesting in the mechanisms of detecting the signal. It's often looking at the level of oxygenation in the brain at very specific locations in the brain. So it's very good at looking at the spatial positioning of activity in the brain. And on the time side of things, it can still give you the information on time. It's less precise than EEG, but it'll still give you some interesting data there. And so what we're seeing now are folks trying to combine those two, for example, those two modalities, as we say. Another very exciting one is MEG. We were talking to Rafal about this earlier, but MEG actually, they use quantum sensors now in these devices. And what MEG does is magnetic encephalography. They collect the data at a very precise time point, much like EEG, but also with much better spatial resolution, which makes it extremely valuable, again, for detecting. The big issue with these devices, though, especially the MRIs and the MEGs, is that you still have to go to the clinic. You still have to go somewhere to get that data collected. So that's fine if you're a relatively late stage of the disorder, and so you can detect it, and okay, well, you've got something, we can treat you. But what if you could detect earlier? What if you could wear something at home and also detect these things? And that's where we're seeing a lot of interest from startups, companies, innovators, researchers who come up with a new technique to collect, in some cases, low quality data or low resolution data, and use modern techniques like machine learning, for example, to increase the resolution of this data so that they can better use the data for detecting these disorders. And now we're seeing like startups and companies build these devices that you can bring at home, or at least maybe in a remote area where you can't necessarily afford a large MRI, and you can't afford the maintenance and all the costs that come with it. And having a much smaller scale device that still allows you to detect things that you can only do with these big devices, up to today. So that's where I think we're seeing a lot of innovation for brain health.
I know on a personal note, my mother was diagnosed probably 15 years ago with a neurodegenerative disorder, an ataxia of MS. And because the diagnosis was so early, she's still kicking butt, because of nutrition and everything else that was required to do that. So that's a very simple example. And she was going to UBC to get, MRIs and so forth done in the Neurological Institutes here in Montreal. So we can see that as our civilization grows, as we become bigger, as we take over more of the earth, we're going to see more of these neurological issues take place, and we're going to have to solve them in real time. And we'll connect the dots here with that space travel piece. So we know that SpaceX and others are launching almost every few days. We do know that space travel will become interplanetary. The question is, how do we monitor cognitive and neurological health in low gravity under sustained radiation? And Elon loves to talk about going to Mars, but we know we haven't solved the radiation issue yet. That's a big thing. But to the question, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, we talked about wearables a little bit, right? About these technologies. I think that's, everybody, I think Rafal just brought it up recently too, but Adam as well. It's really about how do we decentralize, this healthcare, so to speak? How do we bring these things outside? With Adam, we talked about the technology that you guys were building, and this opportunity to essentially bring out, our capacity to sense and diagnose within the hospital, outside of the hospitals. So how do we do that, for example, in space? How do we do that in remote places around Canada, around the world? The new technologies are becoming more portable. They're becoming more energy efficient, which is a big issue, and we talked about it already. We have to, I think, focus in the areas where the diagnostics are going to be key in, capturing these major disorders that you might expect from space. So the research, I think, happening in space is such an important factor, right? Like this is really helping inform us on what are the potential, what's the prevalence of a certain condition that might emerge. What are the risks that we're exposing individuals or humans, right, that are living in the context of high radiation, like you said. We need to build the devices that will help us detect these things much more effectively, as we can all just imagine. But we're looking at, I think, the technology now that not looks at single modalities. We're looking at technologies that combine these modalities. And I think that's the big transformation that we're seeing over the last decade in health and health diagnostics. We often talk about biomarkers, and you're familiar with the concept of a biomarker, essentially something that's an indicator of a disorder. Now, a marker can be a unimodal marker, right? It's one thing that you might capture. So for prostate cancer, you're looking at your PSA levels, right? That's a single marker in your blood for men to detect whether there's going to be a chance of prostate cancer. Now what we're seeing is this multimodal, or essentially detections of markers. And so we're calling them also this concept of digital biomarker. It could be a biological thing, but it's something that you often have to measure, quantify, and combine with others. Alone, they won't tell you that you have a disorder. But combining with other sensors and other measures, you can actually predict at a much higher certainty that somebody's going to be developing a disorder. And I think these devices, what we're going to see is more and more of that emergence of these multimodal devices that alone won't be enough, but taken together, we'll be able to capture these disorders more effectively and with more precision. So that would be my anticipation on where that curve is going. And yeah.
Love it. So let's time jump, Raphael. Fast forward 10 years, how will quantum technology be embedded in our world? Not as a headline, but in the background. Will it be quietly powering systems we barely notice? Where might it show up that we're not even watching yet?
Yeah, maybe here it's where I'm actually an optimist. So like that 10-year time scale does look a lot more promising. And I really want everybody to think back to like maybe the 1940s, early 1950s, and trying to sit there and think, how will digital compute actually disrupt the economy? And the first few things that we can often think of, it's going to break codes and it's going to simulate physics. And oddly, we're not much more interesting with quantum compute now. When you ask me, what can we do? Well, we can break codes and we can simulate physics. So I'm going to say within the next 5 years, RSA encryption is out the window. So if you're still leveraging it and you're using it, Google had a great paper about a month ago that showed that you can now do it on a quantum computer that us, IBM, IonQ, and many others are promising before the end of the decade. So get ready for that. The other one is just a massive disruption that's coming to materials. So whether it be for space travel, whether it be for medicine, any place where you are currently limited in your design of a material, of a molecule, by understanding the fundamental physics and chemistry that's at play, because quantum physics is so difficult to simulate, that is going to be fundamentally disrupted on that 10-year time scale. Beyond that, we're not very imaginative. It's hard to predict. I don't think anybody sitting in the 1940s would have thought about what Tinder looks like on a digital computer. So I can't tell you what quantum Tinder is, but there's definitely a whole host of applications that we are not able to access today because we don't actually have a computer. We're sitting in that Ada Lovelace type of era where we're imagining algorithms for devices that we don't have. And that's incredibly hard to do. Once we have that device, are able to play with it, are able to test it, this will break open really, really quickly. For those of you here working in companies that might be interested in this, get involved now. Like, thinking that you'll be able to do this once there is an available computer is a little bit foolish. There's not going to be a lot of these devices right off the bat. They'll be heavily supply limited, so beginning to de-risk that future is really important.
So, in the future, what's a day in the life of a Torontonian? Let's go 15 years in the future.
Yeah, I mean, I think anything from, all of a sudden we have catalysts for nitrogen fixation that are allowed, to save tens of billions of dollars a year in the production of fertilizers. So food security looks very different. We have catalysts for carbon sequestration. We've solved the singlet fusion problem for solar cells. So efficiencies are pushed now above 80%, maybe making that lunar night actually survivable for space vehicles. New battery materials. Already we're working with Volkswagen in order to tackle the simulation of these materials to build longer lasting, lighter weight and safer batteries. So every single aspect where right now you can think of advanced materials impacting your life, there will be a transformational step of how quickly and at what cost we can bring the materials to market.
So back in 99, 2000, I remember I went to a conference at Oxford. It was the first World Conference on Social Entrepreneurship. And I was very much interested at the time. This is, again, we talked earlier about the first wave of the internet, which was really unlocking the access to the internet, and which was browsers and built data rooms, Oracle, and so forth, right? At that point, I think because we're all about similar age, I think we all probably thought systemic change was going to take place. That we're going to see transformation that would revolutionize how and what we did in society. Fast forward to where we're at right now, the United Nations has its kind of development goals. And I think I've been asked a few times on this question is whether or not the future, what we're doing, what all of you are doing right now, will create that type of systemic change that will help us solve some of those, United Nations development goals. Is kind of what you're seeing. Can I connect to that? You're talking about energy, we're talking about food and so forth.
I mean, it has the potential to. Fundamentally, it's a compute technology, right? So I'm going to say it could be used for social good purposes, it could be used for wealth concentration purposes, it could be used for defensive and offensive military purposes. It really depends on who the customers are and how they use it. I would say internet did bring change.
Yes.
Really massive. How much of that was good versus how much of that was bad is up for debate. And I have a feeling with any large-scale, fundamental technological shift, you're going to see similar things. So there's definitely a question around access, both for governments and the need to build sovereign capacity in Canada for quantum compute, but also social and economical access to these compute technologies. Today we feel we have access to AI through ChatGPT, but very honestly, it's just the surface. To get access to a large-scale NVIDIA data center, you need substantial cash in order to do that. And with quantum compute, I have a feeling we're going to go in a similar direction.
So this is to everyone or anyone. To close out the panel with a spark of curiosity, what's the most underrated, under-the-radar project in your pipeline that deserves far more attention? Something flying below the public radar, but with the potential to define the next decade. Again, another loaded question. If you wish, you can decline if you wish.
So technology that's under the radar, I'm not sure it's quite under the radar, but one area that is very complex in our space is, like many other spaces, but is access to high quality, valuable data that you can trust. And yes, again, sorry, I'm not speaking close enough to the mic. So federated learning is a very exciting and promising technology that is flying a little bit under the radar. Federated learning. So this is where you essentially have data that stay where they're located, and you essentially build a model and you train your model on those data located at these different nodes as part of the network. This is very different from the standard concept of bringing data together into a centralized place, which can take a long time. There are a lot of technical challenges with that because you need to harmonize the data. You need to also pull that data in through download. It depends on the size. You know, when we work with small data sets, it's fine, but when we work with petabytes of genomic data, that can be a challenge. And then there are the governance issues, like the access rules and the legal issues. You're dealing with data that you could potentially train your models on that come from different jurisdictions around the world, Europe versus Americas versus Asia. All these jurisdictions have different rules, and it's very difficult to overcome those challenges. And so we have a really big opportunity right now to leverage technology like federated learning to build better models and have access to data in an ongoing way for these innovators that are building technology that use existing data to build models that will help better diagnose, better understand even the mechanisms of action that lead to a disorder, or even better understand the population at large so that you can maybe subtype and maybe be more precise in the way that you address them. So I'll stop there, but I think federated learning is a very exciting area for us.
So I'm going to tie it back to quantum, I suppose. So I agree that what AI did for digital, quantum is going to do for physical. Right? The way that today, if you have any digital system that doesn't have some element of AI in it, you're doing it wrong. Right? And I think in 10, 15 years, quantum is going to do the same things in the physical world. And I think this is kind of what you were looking at as well, as disruptive and transformative. You know, what that means for us is now our main focus right now is on this nuclear microreactor and energy security. Quantum has an opportunity to create more efficient systems for things like electrification, for things like hydrogen fuel cells. So from a material standpoint, things like quantum electrolysis. How do you make something like electrolysis, which is a well-understood process today, that much more efficient so that you can do it at low energy, generate that much more energy out of something like a nuclear reactor for long-term storage, and create even more advanced energy security capabilities worldwide. So I believe that quantum research is maybe one of those things in our portfolio that is underappreciated, but more granularly at the different applications that we're looking at it for. The quantum sensors are well understood, they exist already. They can be deployed for resource exploration in more precise and sustainable ways than we're doing on Earth today. That's fantastic, but yeah, I think in the future you're looking at how to make physical processes more efficient in a way that we can't imagine right now, and that's the underappreciated part of our portfolio.
Well, we already said quantum, and so much hype. I can't believe you said it's underappreciated. But what I would say is it's actually some of the foundational semiconductor technologies that are up and coming. So there's really exciting things that are happening, especially in the photonic space right now, on new materials that are unlocking capabilities, not just in quantum compute and quantum sensing, but honestly in classical compute for data center interconnects, for chip-to-chip interconnects, and even on a single chip now, people are moving away from copper to actually move to optical co-packaged links to reduce energy, increase speed. So if you're not paying attention to, again, another over-promised, overhyped area of photonics for a very long time, but now that is actually starting to make some really, really big steps, definitely, encourage you to tune in what's happening on that fundamental semiconductor level.
Thanks. So over and over, you heard all about how we're going to be doing something and all this data that we're going to be generating. So to me, the two main things that are underlying all of this is who's going to actually be doing the work, so how are we doing this, and then ensuring that they're following systems and processes that are actually enabling where we want to go as a society, and really leveraging what all this work people are doing to change society in the way that we want to. So, people are generally in conflict, and our whole goal is to change sort of the existential conflict from each other and more into space and very hard problems that we're all going to solve. In order to do that, we need fundamental changes to education systems, all the fundamentals of society. And to me, that's where the Space Institute comes in. That's where Orbit Share comes in. That's where, so all those things are really geared for trying to change things the way we know they can, and knowing that they'll change again.
We are going to take 10 minutes of questions, and then I'll close out with a moderator close. Start right to left. That's your name and question.
Name's Kevin. A question for Raf, actually. When is Bitcoin encryption going to be happen for quantum computing?
Don't worry about it, it's my retirement plan. So. No, very honestly, about a third of the Bitcoin out there has the public key directly in the signature of the transactions. They changed that partway because they ran out of room in the ledger. That is absolutely susceptible to a shores-based RSA attack. The rest of Bitcoin is fairly safe. There might be ways we can think about with quadratic speedups to speed up the hashing process, but no one has very good ideas. But that third of the Bitcoin is susceptible. I believe there's plans to put a quantum cryptographically safe version of that, but yeah. I don't know when it happened, but if you take a look at when they cut that public signature out of the ledger, yeah, it's there.
Hi, Declan here. So I have two questions. I don't know who they're going to, so I'll just... One, okay, so cool. I'll just send it to the panel. So my singular question is in regards to edge devices for quantum computing. I'm sure you guys have all heard of Run One and what Microsoft have been up to. So as a developer, I'm asking, what does the source code look like? Because all software languaging is binary, or at least it's developed on binary architecture, and quantum computing, as we understand, is a whole different thinking. So as you guys are developing edge devices, how do you think about the code for those?
Yeah, there's a couple of frameworks to program quantum computers today. There's most popular ones are Qiskit from IBM and Penny Lane from Xanadu. But there's a whole middleware compilation stack that is very unclear and is actively being developed. So at Xanadu, with University of Waterloo, with folks at NVIDIA, IBM, Oxford Quantum Computing, and others, we're aggressively working towards understanding that middleware compilation stack for fault-tolerant quantum computers, the ones that will be here in 5 years from now. But if today you're interested in programming a quantum computer, go to pennylane.ai, go to IBM's Qiskit website, you can get started, you can run on real hardware, you're ready to go.
Two more questions. John, go ahead.
Hey, so I really appreciate this panel talking. I've already generated a lot of questions, but probably the one that probably touches the most is glioblastoma. So have anyone heard of Michael Bolton before?
You said who?
Michael Bolton. So it's one of my favorite singers. So unfortunately, Michael Bolton has been diagnosed with GBM after reporting some weird symptoms, and I heard GBM is an extremely aggressive malignancy, and it's also unfortunately one of the most common malignant primary brain tumor. So, Francis, how does your idea have applications on the early detection and identifying the pathways from neuroglial cells into glioblastoma formation?
So I'm not a cancer expert, more on the neuroscience side of things, but I mean, I think in general, we want to be able to understand the mechanism under which the disorder is working. In the case of cancer, as far as I know, you have a lot of the autoimmune system or the immune system that can be not detecting cells that carry a certain marker. And what we've been able to do in recent years, and I know this from other researchers in the space, is actually develop new medications that actually leverage your own immune system and boost it at being better at detecting it and then attacking it. So understanding the mechanism of the disorder is really key. And so we're looking at understanding that causal mechanism rather than just looking at signatures or things that might be indicative of something is not enough. And I think that's the big realization that we're having, I think, over the last few decades, that we can actually get closer to the core, carving at its joints, the mechanism that actually leads to the condition. And it's really tough. We primarily work based on correlations of what's happening in the health system, whether it's at the micromolecular level, or the cellular level, or the organ level, or even at the lifestyle level. But we can understand these things better by measuring multiple dimensions. I talked about earlier, this multimodality approach. And in the case of complex disorders, like of course cancer, brain disorders are quintessentially complex, especially when you look at the mental health disorders, extremely complex. How do we understand those better? Is by measuring multiple things and understanding fundamentally the mechanism that leads to them. So hopefully we get there faster.
So hopefully there can be very subtle signs that there's latent glioblastoma that's happening. Even then, multimodally, you have to think about the neuro part and the cancer progression part as well.
There's some strong connections.
Hi, David Palmer with Origin Finance. I have a question about post-quantum encryption. With the post-quantum signature types increasing in size, and you have highly contentious, I would say political, open source developer, I would say almost like a war, very reminiscent of the 2017 block size debate, if you remember that, for Bitcoin. You have this war going on right now with filtering Bitcoin transactions, and so I'm just wondering, do you see, also beyond Bitcoin, do you see with the adoption of post-quantum key sizes being way larger than the current key sizes that we deal with, will we have a kind of a Y2K problem where infrastructure across society has to be upgraded? I mean, my particular focus is Bitcoin, but if you can speak on that or anything beyond that.
Absolutely. So there's three, and again, I might be a little bit out of date. Last time I checked, there were three proposed standards from NIST, National Institute of Standards and Technology in the US, and two from the European Union as well. All of those are now available directly in TTL implementations kind of widely, so you can test them, you can run with them. You can secure your own personal website with these things. The problem is that computationally, it's not even a key size issue, it's the generation and validation of that key that is computationally much more intensive than elliptical curve-based encryption schemes like RSA. This is perfectly fine for Bitcoin, for banking, for many other applications. It's going to be a pain to find everywhere where this is running and actually replace it within your organizations. But the place where it's really getting difficult is in embedded devices. Think about, every single car alarm key fob. Think about every single embedded controller that relies right now on RSA encryption for communication, and those becoming fundamentally unsecure overnight. And now you need to implement a microcontroller with 10 times the computational power just to do the validation of the key that you're going to use under these new standards. So yes, we have standards. They work, at least for now, until somebody breaks them with a classical attack. But fundamentally, they're really challenging to deploy, so we're absolutely headed towards that Y2K type of moment. If you're familiar with DEF CON, there's a quantum village in DEF CON, and this year's theme is actually Y2Q, and it's specifically for that purpose of how are we actually going to do this? How are we going to readapt to a post-quantum crypto world.
What we just heard is a glimpse into the infrastructure of the future, from orbit to interface, from atoms to cognition. These aren't siloed breakthroughs, they're converging into what might become a new operating system for civilization, one where quantum logics guide satellites, neuro AI monitors health across planets, and nuclear systems quietly power a presence beyond Earth. Whether you're here for capital, policy, research, or deep tech, your opportunity is clear. Build the bridges. The real frontier isn't just technological, it's interdisciplinary. The next great leap won't just come from one lab or one discipline. It will come from those who know how to translate between worlds and build across them. On behalf of the organizers, thank you for being here, and to our panelists, thank you for showing us what the edge looks like.